Hello everyone, good evening. I'm sharing my screen. Both the instances are not working, guys. Whatever we have in the V9 sheet, I've just had a word with the vendor as well. Let's see. By the time we plug in logic into the action chain, we might get some positive news from that. So ETAQ is not working. EUDU is responsive, but looks like the password is not working for this one. Let's just give it a try. Let me try to log in as HCM implementation user. But looks like even the HCM user is not working. Just give me one moment, guys. Yeah, I've got the new password for a UDU instance, guys, but not really sure whether that on jobs issue is resolved or not. Because sometime back, remember, the jobs were going into retrain state. But this is a new password that we have got. Let me give it a try. So yes, FinIMPL obviously would have been logged. So I'm trying as HCM implementation user. Yeah, it's working now. And I would go ahead and unlock the FinIMPL user now. I'm going to unlock this user. Let's see MIMPL 13. That also would have been locked. I go ahead and unlock it. Okay, I'll go ahead and log in as FinIMPL user. And we've created the Vbcs application, and we will see today how to send a request from Vbcs to ERP Cloud directly. So we'll see how to send a request from Vbcs to ERP Cloud directly. This is the first thing that we're going to check. Yes, how do we do it? And usually the requests that are submitted in Vbcs application should go through approval process. We'll see that as well. But if a client says approvals are not required, and if you have to send the invoice from Vbcs to ERP directly, what is it that we're going to do? From the edit invoice screen, so this is how the application is looking like. This is our application is looking like. And in the edit invoice screen, we would add a submit button here. And when we hit the submit button, we'll see how to send this AR invoice to ERP Cloud. Let me log in as SpinIMPL here. And yes, this is working. So I'm going to use this sheet, use this instance now. And this one is not working. I'm going to mark it in red. I'm going to copy this instance. And what exactly do we want to do is we want to create an invoice, AR invoice in ERP Cloud application. Looks like somebody has modified the navigation options that we see here because we don't see any fin related work areas. So you go ahead and reset the layout. Now we're going to AR and we want to create an AR invoice in here. So the expectation is we are going to add a submit button here. And when user hits a submit button, we want to send the AR invoice to this Fusion Cloud application. And we need to see that AR invoice in this instance. So how do we do that? So we're going to, let me close all the pages here. And I'm going to open the main start page. And from a live mode, I select an invoice, 46. I'm going to go into edit invoice page. And what exactly are we going to do here? I'll go ahead and select the table here. I'm not going to go into the let me just refresh the page. It's not letting me go down because I need to add a button in there. Yeah, I think it didn't get loaded properly earlier. Now here I need to add a button. I'm going to call it as submit button. And I want to use a danger symbol for it. So that what would happen, user would hit it only when he's absolutely sure about it. And we're going to add an action chain to it. Now, when you add an action chain, guys, normally the action chain would be created as a JavaScript action chain. But dealing with a JavaScript action chain would be very difficult, guys. If it is a JSON action chain, the way you do the mappings is much more easier. And by default, when you create an action chain, it could be a JavaScript action chain that gets created rather than JSON. So what we do is we go into the action chains here, and I'm going to create a new action chain as a JSON action chain. So when you create a new action chain explicitly, then you would have an option to choose between JavaScript and JSON. JSON is much more easier to work with. So you create a JSON action chain, and I'm going to call it as submit button action chain. And when user hits a submit button, I want to perform the actions that I'm going to put in here. So before I forget it, let me link this submit button action chain here. I'm going to add a submit button action chain here. And we also don't need that other action chain. This is the one that got created by default. I'm going to delete it. And if you go into submit button action chain, now what exactly do I want to do? So as and when user hits a submit button here, I want to go to this instance and create AR invoice here. So as and when user hits a submit button, we need to go to this instance and create AR invoice here. So the first thing that I need to do is, remember, I need to check if there is a REST API to create AR invoice in ERP Cloud. So I go into financials, integrate, review REST APIs, review REST APIs. Okay. And when we, review REST APIs, and we need to search for receivables invoices. So I'm searching for AR invoice here, and here we have an endpoint to create AR invoice in ERP Cloud, and this is a URL that I need to call. So I need to go ahead and register this as a service connection first. I need to register that REST API as a service connection. And I say defined by endpoint URL. And it is a post method. And I want to create AR invoice in a UDU instance. So I'm going to prefix this URL. And the action hint has to be create. And you create a backend. And you can call the backend as ERP backend or ERP REST backend. And we have authentication details here. In IMPL and the password. You go ahead and create it. Now you can call this as AR invoice API. AR invoice API. And you go into operation and you say create AR invoice in ERP. Now you can go to the request payload and you can enter a sample request payload here. Now to create AR invoice in ERP cloud, just give me one moment, guys. So we can get in, since it's a post endpoint, right? To get the sample request payload, we don't have to go elsewhere. So we just go in here and we see the sample request payload. We see the sample request payload here. And what I did is I copied the sample request payload. And from this payload, I've taken out optional fields. Say to create AR invoice in ERP cloud, what are the details that we need to mention? So we need to have the customer details. We need to have a bill to and ship to customer details. We need to pass in lines information and so on, right? So I've copied the sample request payload and I created a sample JSON request and the response payloads. And I created a sample JSON request and the response payloads. Okay, so if I take out those sample request and response, if I take out those optional fields from here, like comments, description, and so on. And that's how I prepared this sample request and response payloads. If you go into Vbcs, AR invoice web app, you would be able to see a request payload JSON file and a response payload JSON file. Okay, so you see a request payload JSON, and we also see a response payload JSON file. Now, if you look at the request payload JSON, you have a sample request payload here. And in the sample request payload, what exactly do you see here? You see the invoice header details at the top. You see the invoice header details at the top, the bill to customer details and the transaction details. And we also see the line section as well. And in the line section, we have description, quantity, and USP. In the line section, you have description, quantity, and USP, right? So we have, this is a sample request payload that I have. Bare minimum, we need to pass in 6 or 7 header fields. And at the line level, we need to have at least 3 fields captured. So I copy the sample request payload. I'm going to enter it here. Save it as an example request. And we go to the test button and we can fire off a request. So you can send a request here. Now, if so, we're testing this REST API standalone here. So if this goes through, it should create AR invoice in ERP Cloud. And if that is successful, we would see a response here. We're going to save it as an example response. And we would call this REST API from the action chain. We would call this REST API from the action chain. Okay, so I'm going to save it as an example response. And I say create. I go to the endpoints. And here we see that there's an option to create AR invoice in ERP Cloud. So I want to call this REST API from the action chain. I want to call that REST API. And which REST API do you want to call? The service connection, the REST API, standard AR invoice REST API. And when we create a post endpoint, you know very well what we have to do, right? So we need to pass in, or we can pass in only one single payload variable as input here. We can pass in only one single payload variable as input here. Okay, so what do I need to do? I need to first create a data type of this endpoint, a variable of that data type, and I need to initialize that variable here. And that variable is what I have to pass as input to the endpoint. So you go to the data types, create a data type from endpoint, select the endpoint, and I'm going to call it as create AR invoice in ERP type. I'm going to select all the fields in the request sample request payload. Whatever fields I have in a sample request payload, I'm selecting all of them. 7 invoice header fields and 3 line level fields. And click on finish. And we go to variables and we would create a new variable here of that data type. So this variable that I'm creating now would have invoice header details, and you also have the line details as well. Now we need to initialize that variable here first, and I need to pass in that variable as input. So we need to initialize that variable. We need to assign values to it first. So this is a variable that we need to initialize. Create AR invoice ERP variable. And if you look at the page invoice variable, you have invoice header level fields, business unit, currency code, payment terms, transaction date, source, and type. So I've initialized the invoice header details. But we also need the line details as well, right? So not just the invoice header. Remember, for an invoice to be created, we also need to have the lines here. But if you see here, if you look at the page invoice variable, in the page invoice variable, what do we see, guys? We only see the invoice header section. We only see the invoice header section, so we don't see the line section. So whatever fields that you, so whatever values that you see here, who is providing data for this table, guys? It is a receivables invoice. So there is a REST API call going on. There is a REST API call going on in the background. And from the REST API call, we're getting the results here. So if you go into the data tab, you see the results in this table are coming in from this receivables invoice line list service data provider. Okay, the results in the table are coming in from receivables invoice line list STP. Okay, now if you go to the variables here, you see the receivables invoice line list STP, receivables invoice line list STP. You see this receivables invoice line list STP. If you go back into action chain, remember receivables invoice line list STP, this service data provider is pulling the lines that belong to that particular invoice and displaying those details in the table here. Okay. So, but if you look at the mapper here, if you open the service data provider in the mapper, what exactly do you see in here? So we don't see the line fields. We don't get to see whatever are the fields that you see here. We don't get to see them. We don't get to see them in the service data provider. We don't get to see them in the service data provider here. So what we need to do is, yes, the details are displayed here. They are pulled during a runtime with a REST API call in the background. But I need to pull this information as well when I call the REST API to create AR invoice in ERP. So what I have to do, I have my requirement is I have invoice ID with me, and based on invoice ID, I need to pull the lines information. Based on invoice ID, I need to pull the lines information. So I need to call a REST API here. And which REST API do I want to call? If I go into business objects, you see lines here. There are two get endpoints, one endpoint to fetch all the lines, and the second endpoint to fetch lines based on a line ID. Okay, first endpoint would fetch all the lines, second endpoint would fetch the lines based on a specific line ID. Okay, now if it is get all lines, so yes, I'm going to select get all lines. And to this endpoint, I want to pass in a filter. And what's a filter that I want to pass in? I want to pass in a filter and say, don't pull all the lines, but pull only the lines whose invoice. Remember the same filter that I applied here, I'm applying the same filter here. Pull me only the lines whose invoice equals invoice ID you are viewing on page. Okay, so this would ensure that it would pull only the lines of that invoice. And I can look at this REST API called response. And in the response of this REST API call, I'll be able to find the lines information. And I'm going to initialize this line section with it. I'm going to initialize this line section with that result. So here we're getting the lines. Here we are getting the lines. And I go to the items here, map the repeating row, and you need to map the description, quantity, and USP. Okay. Now, after we initialize the header and the line details on the invoice payload variable, I just have to pass that in here, this particular variable here. So we have the invoice header and the line details initialized, and I'm passing that as input now. Yes, we shall. We shall hear on mute. Please
Yes.
go on.
Yes, Prasad, what is the difference? I think I got lost. Why we define for the header level information a new variable? Because I understood until that part where you say it is only, there is a one variable to map and we want to map it individually. So we created a new type and then we created a new variable to support that. But the logic which you used, correct, for getting an invoice line, we could have used the same kind of logic to get even in invoice header also.
But why do I have to do it? That invoice header details are already available here, right? Invoice header details are already available here for me. Why do I have to make a REST API call? Okay, let me
line
ask you this thing.
also is
Okay.
there, correct? Lines are also there on the same page.
Okay. Show me where the lines are there in this page. So this is a page variable invoice, right? So how many fields you see here? 12 fields.
Those 12 fields, correct. Header
Okay.
level.
And these header fields. And where is this information coming from? Through the REST API call. And which REST API is giving you that information? This service data provider is giving you that information. But you search for half an hour in this one, you will not be able to find the details there. So since this line's information that you're seeing on page is not available in the mapper, I don't have a choice but to make another REST API call to get this line's information based on invoice ID, and when from that I need to do the mapping. Okay, so that's why I'm calling this REST API to get all the lines based on invoice ID. And in the results, what am I trying to do? Now I have the lines information available in the mapper. I don't have the lines information available earlier. Now I have the lines information available, and I did the mapping.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
I've passed it. Yeah, thank you. I've passed that variable as input here. Now, after the REST API call is successful, what exactly do we want to do? I just want to go back and update the status as completed. That's the first thing that I want to do. And I also want to stamp the transaction number. So I want to update the invoice. And how are you going to update an invoice? So you call a REST API again. And what REST API do you want to call? Batch invoice. And I need to mention which invoice to update first. And I also need to pass in sample payload here. So what are the fields that I want to update? So what do you do here? You need to create a custom data type here. Again, from endpoint, I'm going to say update invoice endpoint. Status and the transaction number. Only two fields I want to update now. Status and the transaction number. And I would say there are only two fields that I want to update. I'm creating that variable now. I'm creating a variable of that data type. And after you create a variable of that data type, you can go ahead and assign values to that. So you go to this particular variable. And I'm going to mark the status as completed. And what else I need to do? Whatever is the transaction number that we have, remember we were calling a REST API and that gives you back a response. And in the response, you have a transaction number. So I'm going to print that transaction number and populate it here. So I've created a variable with two fields in it, status and transaction number. I've marked the status as completed, updated the transaction number from the response, and I want to pass that variable as input here. I want to pass that variable as input here. Update invoice, status transaction number variable. And after the invoice is updated, what else do we need to do? We need to do two more steps. I want to fire off a confirmation message saying that yes, invoice is created successfully. Yeah, cloud successfully. And in the second line, I want to print the transaction number. Whatever is a transaction created in ERP cloud, you go ahead and print the transaction number in the second line. Invoice created in ERP successfully, print the transaction number here. And we want to print the notification not as an error, we want to print it as a confirmation. And we also want to navigate the user back to the previous page. So here you go to the navigation option and you say navigate back. So what are the actions that we are performing in the action chain? We are fetching the lines information based on invoice ID. We've prepared a payload variable to initialize and initialized it with the invoice header and the line details. And I'm passing that variable and I'm calling a standard AR invoice REST API with the invoice header and line details passed as input as a single variable. And if it is successful, I'm preparing another payload variable to update invoice status as completed and the transaction number. And I'm calling that update invoice REST API here, firing off a confirmation message. And I'm also navigating the user back to the previous page. And there are three failure branches here. and you can print in appropriate error messages here. So you can say that error while fetching the lines, error while creating AR invoice in ERP, error while updating invoice in Vbcs. And you can also print the error message as well. Now we can go ahead and test this. I can pick up invoice 46, edit it, and I can see the invoice header and the line details here. I can go ahead and submit it. Now, the moment you submit it, all the actions that you have in that action chain would be executed successfully. So all the actions were executed. AR invoice is created in ERP. This is a transaction number. The invoice is also updated in VBCS. Transaction number stamped and the status also updated. You see a confirmation message at the top. And you also see that user is navigated back to the landing page. Now I can go to the AR invoice here and I can search for that transaction number here. Can search for the transaction number here. And you see that it's a manual invoice that we have. It's created for Easy Solutions customer. So you see the invoice header details here, the customer information, and we also see the lines information as well. Okay, and you see the quantity, unit price, and all that. So with whatever details you have the invoice created here, with whatever details you have invoice here, it's an invoice against Easy Solutions customer in US1 BU for amount 5,000, manual invoice 30-net payment term, 2 lines with amount 2 and 2,000, 1 and 1,000. So with all those details, 2 lines, 2, 2,000, 1,000, manual invoice in US1 BU for Easy Solutions customer 30-net payment term. Invoice is created in ERP Cloud with those details. Tax is auto-calculated. And yes, when I call the standard REST API, I was passing in the actual USP as input, but you can pass in the discounted total if you want. You can pass in the discounted total. Maybe you can apply this 30% discount on USP and you can pass in that value if you want. So if required, yes, we can send the AR invoice from VBCS to ERP directly by plugging in an action chain like this. But would that usually be the case? Most probably no, because clients would ask you to invoke an approval process here, and only after the invoice is approved by 2 or 3 approvers, we kick off a REST API, and through the REST API, we create AR invoice in ERP. So any questions so far, guys? Okay. And another important point is, especially when you build a complex action chains like this one, you might the application might not work as expected. Application might not work as expected. So in such cases, what you can do is, how do you debug them? To debug the VBCS applications, what you can do is, you can go ahead and open up more tools, developer tools, and you would be able to see the console log here. You will be able to see the console log here. You can clear it out. So whatever actions you perform within the action chain, within the VBCS app, whatever actions you perform, those actions will be listed down here. Those actions will be listed down here. So for example, if I pick up an invoice, the moment I select an invoice, what do you see happening here? The moment I select a first row in a table, first selected row event will be fired. And that selected ID variable, remember there was one selected ID variable, right? That gets initialized, and that is getting that got initialized with a value as 46. And after that, we are assigning this, since that selected ID variable has a value, these 2 buttons got enabled. And if I go ahead and hit the edit invoice button now, what is it that you see? Whatever logic is getting involved in the backend, all those actions would be visible here. So for example, when I come in here, what would happen? There would be a REST API call that goes on to fetch the invoice information, right? There will be a REST API call that goes on to fetch the edit invoice information. So you see, it executed navigation to edit invoice. And it has navigated to edit invoice page with invoice ID 46. And after it navigated to it, you would be able to see a REST API call going on to get the lines information, to get the invoice information. You see this endpoint is called to get the invoice information based on invoice ID. And you would be able to see the response as well. So for each and every step that happens within the action chain or within the pages would be executed here. Now I cleared everything. And if I hit the cancel button, whatever happens in that cancel chain action button, you would be able to see it. Now I clicked on cancel button action chain. So there is only one action in it called navigate back, and that is executed. So this way, in case your action chain is not working as expected, you can go ahead and go into console log, enable it, and then you try to debug it. Because normally when you do these complex action chains, right, there's probably a chance that you might miss one mapping or the other. Okay, and we are sending a request from Vbcs to ERP now, right? But what is the usual process, guys? The usual process would be that we need to call an approval process that we build in PCS from Vbcs. So what is it that we should do? We should build, we go to PCS, we need to create an approval process there. And let me show you what approval process we're going to build. So this is the approval process we're going to build. And this approval process, we're going to create it from scratch. And yes, we're not going to create this approval process as the first one in PCS because this is a pretty complex one. So we will create another PCS app for travel approval first, understand the basics of PCS and how it works. And then we will create this approval process from scratch. And yes, we're going to create this approval process and we would call this approval process from a Vbcs app. And let me show you how it's going to happen. Two important things I want to explain. So we go to UG62. So this is how the action chain is going to look like. So after we fetch the lines information, we would call the approval information. We would call a REST API to start approval process in PCS. We would call a REST API to start approval process in PCS. And I'm going to select this process in here in this REST API call. And say, for example, if user has selected this particular invoice 46, and I hit the submit button. The moment I hit the submit button, what would happen? So we're calling this approval process. And when I call this approval process, remember there are three approvers here. First, it would go to my manager who does basic cursory checks. And after that, it would go to audit team. And audit team would thoroughly validate the invoice. And if everything is fine, after thorough validation, we would send it to finance director for optional approval if amount is more than 1,000. If amount is more than 1,000, we will send the invoice for third level of approval, which is optional. So this is required only if amount is more than 1,000. Otherwise, 2 levels of approval is more than enough. So tell me one thing is, let's say Vishal is my manager, and I submitted a request from here. So yes, we will submit. I submit an invoice from here, and immediately Vishal would receive an email. Yes, of course, in approval process in PCS, we can enable email notifications. And as soon as I submit invoice 46, Vishal would receive an email saying that Prasad has submitted invoice 46 for your approval. Now tell me one thing is, will Vishal be able to approve the invoice with just one-liner information? Vishal, I come to you and say, or you receive an email saying that, yes, invoice 46 submitted by Prasad for approval, please act on it. you won't be able to take a decision, right? What do you need to take a decision?
List invoice header details
Invoice
and maybe
header
lines also.
and the lines
Yes.
also, right? So how do we make this information available to the approvers in PCS? The way we do it is, in PCS, we create a form. In PCS, we create a form, and this form is created only to be used as a placeholder. So we create a form in PCS with invoice header and the lines information, and we attach this form to the start node of the process. We attach this node. We attach this node to the start event. We attach that node to the start node. So we're going to attach the form to the start node. And so that what would happen, whenever I call the approval process, whenever I call the approval process from Vbcs, I will be passing in all the invoice header and the line details. I'll be passing in the invoice header and the line details as input. Okay, so I'll be passing in the invoice header and the line details as input here when I call the approval process. So when I pass in that invoice header and the line details as input, when I throw these fields, the invoice header and the line fields as input, yes, I receive those inputs here, and I'm going to capture it in that particular form. So when I throw 10 variables, 10 fields as input, I need a form to capture that, right? So that's why you create that user interface of form, and you attach that form to the start node. And whatever data we pass in, the invoice header and lines information will be passed from Vbcs as input to the PCS. And that form is what we are going to attach to the managers. So when an approval task is assigned to a manager, I'm going to say in the approval task, they're going to see this. It says manager, invoice reference 46 is submitted for your approval. And we would also print a few important fields of invoice in the summary. And we would also give them an option to approve and reject an invoice. But the most important part is we would attach an invoice form here, so that what would happen? Yes, whatever details we receive from Vbcs, which are captured in the form, because form is attached to the start node, those details are populated in the form. And when Vishal clicks on the approval task assigned to him, he would be able to see that form opening up, whatever form is created in PCS, and in that form, he would be able to see the invoice header and the line details populated. Okay, and we are going to check, and we would check if that, so after the invoice is approved, and yes, so we need to make the invoice information. First of all, we need to receive the invoice information from Vbcs to PCS. We need to receive it in the form of, in the form. And we would attach that form. We capture those details received from Vbcs in a form, the header and the line details. We would attach that form to the approver nodes. And after the first approver approves it, we check if the invoice is approved. If invoice, so we'll get into the specifics of it later on. Okay, so when it comes to interaction between PCS and Vbcs, the first important part is we create a form in PCS, attach it to the start node, so that when we call the PCS process from Vbcs, we pass in all the invoice details as input. And to every approver node, there is a form attached. That form we're going to attach so that the approver gets to see the invoice details. And the second important point is when an invoice is submitted for approval, remember, based on a user submitting a request, it would go through the approvals. So if I submit it, it would go to my manager, audit team, my audit team approver, and my finance director. So when a different user submits it, these three approvers could be completely different. So what we usually do is we also work out the approvers based on a requester in Vbcs itself. In Vbcs, what we do is we create an approval hierarchy business object. And in this business object, we're going to store the approval matrix or approval hierarchy information. Like we store the requesters here. And for every requester, we're going to capture who is level 1, level 2, and level 3 approved. Okay. So based on the requester information, so based on the person submitting a request, we come in here, we search for the user, see who is submitting it. We search for that in the requester. And if it is Prasad submitting it, Swapna is going to be the manager. It will go to Swapna first, and after she approves it, it will go to Mridul, and after he approves it, it will go to Sundar. So the approval hierarchy information or approval matrix is also maintained in VBCS itself in a separate business object. And based on the person submitting a request, we would also work out who the approver is. So you see there's one more REST API call that I'm doing here to get the approvers based on the user submitting a request. And yes, when we call the REST API here, approval process, we are going to pass in not just the invoice header and the line details. Yes, we will pass in the invoice header and the line details as well. That is fine. Apart from the invoice header and line details, we also have 3 more fields to receive the approval information: level 1, level 2, and level 3 approvers. So if you go into PCS form, remember, apart from the invoice header and the line level fields, we also have approver information as well. And this approval information is going to be received from VBCS itself. Based on the user submitting it, we are going to receive these details as well. And whatever level 1, level 2, and level 3 approvers you're going to receive as input into PCS process, we would select that users here. So when I select, when I go to manager, whom am I going to select it? I'll select as a manager. It is the manager that I received from VBCS. And here, whatever I receive a second level approver, I'm going to select that particular user here, income systems team approver, and so on. So when approval process is called from VBCS, first of all, we need to pass in the invoice header details and approvers information as well, so that the invoice information, whatever invoice information and approvers invoice information is received here, that would be captured in a form, and that form is attached to the approver node so that they get to see the invoice and the header and the line details. And whatever approvers we receive as input, we are going to select those approvers in this approval task. Okay, 2 important pieces of information we receive as input into PCS from VBCS. And after that, we're going to build this approval process, discussing the details at a later stage. Okay, so everybody clear on these 2 points, guys? Like what inputs we pass in from VBCS to PCS? Any questions? Okay. Now we need to, before we create this AR invoice approval process, we would build a travel approval process first, understand the basics of PCS, and then we'll come back and create this approval process from scratch. Okay, I think we just have 10 minutes left. So let's do it this way. Let's create the travel approval process tomorrow, understand the basics first, and then I think it would take a whole session. And day after tomorrow, we're going to create this AR invoice approval process from scratch. Okay. Any questions, guys, from anyone?
Prasad, can you share that Fusion credentials?
It is already updated in the sheet, right?
But it is not coming in my mail because it's the existing one. It is showing December.
I didn't get your point. Can you share your screen?
Just a minute. I am opening mine. So this is my screen.
Okay. Which batch are you in, first of all? Can you give me a call me on my mobile number? We'll discuss.
Sure. I will call you. No problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone. See you tomorrow.